The August afternoon lay heavy and golden over the village of St. Mary Mead. The sort of day when even the bees seem to move with languid deliberation through the hollyhocks. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary wicker chair beneath the shade of her garden's ancient oak, set down her knitting with a small sigh of satisfaction. The ivory lace she was working on for the church bazaar was progressing nicely, though her fingers, once so nimble, did protest a bit more these days. The voice of her young friend, Bunch Harmon, the vicar's wife, floated over the garden wall. Miss Marple had not forgotten. Indeed, she had been contemplating whether her blue voile or the grey silk would be more appropriate. One did not wish to appear overdressed, but Mrs. Ashworth had such exacting standards. An hour later, Miss Marple made her way along the high street, her sensible shoes clicking against the warm pavement. Ashworth House stood at the far end of the village, a rambling Victorian edifice with more gables than seemed strictly necessary. Its gardens, however, were the pride of St. Mary Mead, and Lydia Ashworth's annual garden party was the social event of the summer. The lawn was already dotted with guests when Miss Marple arrived. White-clothed tables bore the weight of cucumber sandwiches and Victoria sponge. A small quartet played something appropriately gentle near the rose arbor. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from a young server and positioned herself strategically near the herbaceous border, where one could observe without appearing to do so. "Such a lovely turnout," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, materializing at Miss Marple's elbow with the inevitability of a recurring decimal. "Though I must say, I'm surprised to see Captain Hargreaves here." Miss Marple's keen blue eyes tracked across the lawn to where a tall, military-looking man stood rather stiffly by himself, teacup held like a defensive weapon. Captain Richard Hargreaves, retired from the Indian Army these past 5 years, had the weathered look of a man who had spent too long in harsh climates, and perhaps, Miss Marple reflected, too long nursing disappointments. "One must not credit all the gossip one hears," Miss Marple said mildly, though she filed away the observation with the mental precision of a librarian cataloguing books. Their hostess, Lydia Ashworth, moved through the gathering with practiced grace. She was a handsome woman in her middle 50s, perfectly coiffed and dressed in dove grey that set off her still dark hair. Her late husband, Edmund Ashworth, had made his fortune in shipping before his untimely death 3 years prior. The widow had remained in St. Mary Mead, though there were those who whispered she was too grand now for village life. "Lydia does carry herself well," observed Mrs. Price Ridley with the faintest edge to her voice. "Though one does wonder about that nephew of hers. Dennis, isn't it?" Dennis Forrester was indeed very modern, lounging near the refreshment table in what Miss Marple suspected was an intentionally casual pose. 28 or thereabouts, with the sort of sleek good looks that suggested regular attention to grooming. He worked, if one could call it work, in something to do with advertising in London, and visited his aunt with the regularity of someone who expected to inherit. Miss Marple noticed how his eyes followed Vera Thornton, Mrs. Ashworth's companion. Vera was a pale, anxious creature of perhaps 35, dressed in an unfortunate shade of brown that did nothing for her complexion. She moved about the party with the nervous efficiency of someone perpetually expecting criticism. "More tea, Mrs." Vera's voice carried across the lawn. "Not just now, Vera." The afternoon progressed with the steady predictability of such gatherings. Miss Marple exchanged pleasantries with various villagers, each interaction adding to her internal catalogue of human behaviour. There was young Dr. Haydock, recently taken over his father's practice, paying rather marked attention to Angela Ashworth, Mrs. Ashworth's niece, and only close relative besides Dennis. Angela was a pretty girl of 23, fair and delicate, with an unfortunate tendency toward nervous complaints that Miss Marple suspected were more circumstantial than constitutional. "Aunt Lydia has been so good to me," Angela was saying to the doctor, her voice carrying despite its softness. Miss Marple observed the way Dr. Haydock's expression softened. Young love, or something approaching it. But was it mutual? Angela's eyes, Miss Marple noted, occasionally darted toward Dennis Forrester, with an expression that was difficult to read. It was at precisely 4 o'clock when the incident occurred. Mrs. Ashworth had gathered a small group in the drawing room to show them her latest acquisition, a music box of remarkable craftsmanship. Miss Marple, her curiosity aroused, had joined the small procession inside. The drawing room was cool after the heat of the garden, all dark wood and heavy curtains. On a marble-topped table sat an exquisite piece, a lacquered box about 10 inches square, decorated with intricate oriental designs in gold and scarlet. "It arrived just last week," Mrs. Ashworth explained, her voice carrying an unusual note of excitement. "From an estate sale in Derbyshire, 18th century, possibly earlier." She lifted the lid with careful fingers. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a small mechanical wheeze, a delicate melody began to play, a haunting minor key air that seemed somehow familiar yet unplaceable. "How charming," murmured someone. But Miss Marple noticed that Captain Hargreaves, who had somehow found his way into the group, had gone quite white. His teacup rattled against its saucer. Miss Marple inquired gently. "Perfectly," he managed, though his voice was strained. Mrs. Ashworth closed the lid, and the music stopped with an abruptness that was almost shocking. "There's a curious story attached to it," she continued, her eyes bright. "According to the previous owner's notes, this music box has a rather macabre reputation." A nervous laugh rippled through the small assembly. "How perfectly Gothic," Dennis drawled. "Yes, well, I don't put stock in such nonsense," Mrs. Ashworth said briskly, though Miss Marple detected a faint unease beneath her assured manner. "But it does add a certain—" They returned to the garden, where the party continued its pleasant course. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by something she could not quite name. It was like catching a scent on the breeze, present but not identifiable. The guests began to depart as the afternoon wore into early evening. Miss Marple, preparing to take her leave, nearly collided with Vera Thornton in the hallway. The companion's hands fluttered nervously. She was carrying a small medicine bottle. "Mrs. Ashworth's tonic. She takes it before dinner." She trailed off, awareness of impropriety catching up with her tongue. "We all have our little routines," Miss Marple said kindly. As she walked home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple reflected on what she had observed. a surface of propriety and social grace, certainly. But underneath? She thought of Captain Hargreaves's reaction to the music box, of Dennis Forrester's watchful eyes, of Angela's nervous glances, of Vera Thornton's perpetual anxiety. In her experience, considerable, though mostly garnered within a 5-mile radius of St. Mary Mead, surfaces often conceal depths. And depths, as she well knew, sometimes held dark secrets. She was nearly home when she heard it, faint but distinct, carried on the evening air from the direction of Ashworth House. The silvery, haunting notes of a music box playing. Miss Marple stopped in her tracks, her sensible heart beating rather faster than usual. Someone, it seemed, had opened the music box again. Or perhaps, and this thought came unbidden, perhaps it had opened itself. She shook her head at her own fanciful thinking and continued home. Yet as she prepared for bed that evening, she found herself unable to shake a sense of foreboding. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned to trust these feelings. They were rarely wrong. The music box had played, and if the legend were to be believed, Miss Marple did not finish the thought. Instead, she said her prayers, checked that her window was properly latched, and composed herself for sleep. But sleep came slowly, and when it did, she dreamed of music boxes and secrets, and of something dark waiting in the shadows of a Victorian drawing room. The telephone's shrill ring shattered the morning quiet of Miss Marple's cottage at 7:30, an unconscionably early hour for a call in St. Mary Mead, where such urgencies were mercifully rare. Miss Marple, already dressed and halfway through her breakfast of toast and marmalade, set down her teacup with a hand that trembled only slightly. Early morning calls, in her experience, heralded nothing pleasant. It was Bunch Harmon, her voice high and strained. "Oh, Miss Marple, something dreadful has happened. Mrs." The words seemed to hang in the air, as tangible as the steam rising from Miss Marple's abandoned tea. For a moment, she thought of the music box, of its silvery notes drifting through the evening air. Only when someone is about to die. "I shall come at once," Miss Marple said quietly. "Vera Thornton, this morning when she went to wake her with her morning tea." Within 20 minutes, Miss Marple had made her way to Ashworth House. The morning sun, which had seemed so benign at breakfast, now cast an almost accusatory light over the Victorian pile. A small knot of villagers had already gathered at a respectful distance from the gates, their faces bearing that peculiar expression of shock mingled with an excitement they would never admit to feeling. Inside, the house had the hushed, suspended quality of a place where death has come calling. Vera Thornton sat in the morning room, a cup of tea cooling untouched beside her. Her face was the colour of old parchment, and her hands shook continuously as though afflicted by palsy. "Miss Marple," she whispered as the older woman entered. "It was terrible. I knocked, you see, as I always do at 7 o'clock precisely." Miss Marple settled herself beside the distraught companion. "You've had a dreadful shock," had Mrs. Vera's hands twisted in her lap. "No, that's just it. She seemed perfectly well. Perhaps a little tired after the party, but that was to be expected. She took her tonic, as always, and retired at 10 o'clock. Nothing at all. I sleep on the second floor, you see, while Mrs. Ashworth's room is on the first." A sudden thought seemed to strike her, and she looked up with reddened eyes. "The music box, Miss Marple. It played last evening. I heard it myself, around 8:30. But no one was in the drawing room." Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of footsteps announced the arrival of Dr. Haydock. The young physician looked grave, his usual cheerful demeanour entirely absent. "Miss Marple." There was no criticism in his tone, merely a weary acknowledgement. "Is it as she suggested, Doctor?" Haydock glanced toward Vera, then back to Miss Marple. "I'd prefer not to say definitively until the post-mortem examination, but there are irregularities." "Poison," Miss Marple said quietly. It was not a question. "Possibly, though I cannot imagine Mrs. Ashworth had no enemies that I know of." Miss Marple thought of Captain Hargreaves' strained face, of Dennis Forrester's calculating eyes, of Angela's nervous glances. Admired, perhaps. But was respect the same as affection? And what secrets might lie beneath the surface of admiration? The sound of voices in the hallway announced new arrivals. Inspector Slack from the Much Benham police force entered with his characteristic heavy tread, followed by his long-suffering sergeant. Slack was a thick-set man with a suspicious nature and an unfortunate tendency to jump to obvious conclusions. "Right then," he announced to the room at large, "nobody leaves the house." The party guests numbered nearly 40, Miss Marple observed mildly. Slack's eyes narrowed. "Miss Marple, I might have known. Well, you can make yourself useful and provide me with a list of who attended." There was no love lost between Miss Marple and Inspector Slack, who had never forgiven her for solving several cases he had considered closed. Nevertheless, she inclined her head graciously. The morning wore on in a blur of questions and subdued conversations. Angela Ashworth had been summoned from her room, where she had apparently taken to her bed with a sedative after hearing the news. She appeared in a pale pink dressing gown, her eyes swollen from weeping. "I can't believe it," she kept repeating. "Aunt Lydia was so vibrant yesterday." Dennis Forrester, by contrast, seemed more irritated than grief-stricken. He had driven down from London that very morning, having stayed in town after the party, and seemed put out by the inconvenience of police questioning. "I left at 6 o'clock yesterday evening," he told Inspector Slack, with barely concealed impatience. "Had a dinner engagement in town," Slack demanded. "Several people, as it happens. I had dinner at the Savoy with business associates, then went to my club." Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a corner of the drawing room, observed them all. The music box sat on its marble table, silent and somehow malevolent. On an impulse she could not quite explain, she rose and approached it. "I wouldn't touch that, Miss Marple," Slack warned. But she studied it carefully, noting every detail. The lacquer was very fine, the gold leaf undimmed by age, and there, nearly invisible unless one looked closely, were what appeared to be scratches near the base. Fresh ones, she thought, where the wood showed lighter beneath the lacquer. Someone had been examining this box very carefully indeed. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe you may wish to have this music box examined very thoroughly, and perhaps inquire into its provenance." Mrs. Slack looked baffled. Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. "Perhaps nothing at all, Inspector." By afternoon, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the efficiency of wildfire through dry bracken. Miss Marple found herself besieged at her garden gate by a succession of visitors, each eager to share their theories and, more importantly, to extract whatever information she might possess. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived first, bearing a wholly unnecessary sponge cake and an abundance of speculation. "Poison, they're saying," she announced, settling herself in Miss Marple's sitting room with the air of one preparing for a lengthy siege. "Though who would wish to poison Lydia Ashworth, I cannot imagine." She leaned forward conspiratorially. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their rhythmic clicking. "The will, Mrs. Oh yes, my cousin's husband's sister works for Messrs. Gryce and Packington, the solicitors in Much Benham. She happened to mention, quite by accident you understand, that Mrs. Ashworth had recently made changes to her will." Miss Marple's tone suggested polite attention rather than avid curiosity, though her mind was working with considerably more vigour. 3 weeks ago, apparently. Just after that nephew of hers, Dennis, had visited. There was some sort of quarrel, my cousin's husband's sister understood. Before Miss Marple could pursue this intriguing line of inquiry, the doorbell announced another visitor. This time it was Colonel Melchett, the chief constable, looking harassed and apologetic. "Miss Marple, forgive the intrusion," Mrs. Price Ridley, recognizing dismissal when she saw it, gathered her belongings with barely concealed resentment and departed. Colonel Melchett waited until her footsteps had faded before speaking. "It's Slack," he said without preamble. "He's convinced it's Captain Hargreaves. Says the man had motive, some business about lost investments, and no alibi for the crucial hours." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Dash it all! I don't know what to think. The post-mortem results came back an hour ago. Digitalis poisoning, Haydock says. A substantial dose, administered sometime between 8 and 11 o'clock last evening. The thing is, Hargreaves does grow foxgloves in his garden. As do half the gardens in St. Mary Mead, including my own," Miss Marple observed. "Quite so. That's why I'm here. You were at the party yesterday. You observe things." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. Captain Hargreaves was certainly distressed by the music box. He went quite pale when Mrs. Ashworth played it. But distress is not guilt, Colonel. Fear of memories, perhaps. The music box again. Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp. "Tell me, Colonel, what do you know of Mrs. Vera?" "Nothing much. Been with Mrs. Ashworth for about 2 years. Came with excellent references, I understand. She mentioned that Mrs. Ashworth took a tonic each evening. Did Dr. Melchett's expression sharpened. "By Jove, I don't know." After the Colonel's departure, Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands idle in her lap. Digitalis. It was, she reflected, a curious choice of poison. Swift enough to be effective, but also traceable, identifiable. Either their murderer was careless or supremely confident. Or, she thought with a sudden chill, they wished the poisoning to be discovered. The afternoon post brought an unexpected development. Among the usual circulars and parish notices was a letter, addressed in an uncertain hand. Miss Marple opened it with careful fingers. "Dear Miss Marple, I hope you will forgive the liberty of writing to you, but I find myself in such distress that I hardly know where to turn. There are things about Mrs. Ashworth's death that I cannot bring myself to tell the police, not yet at least, but which weigh heavily upon my conscience. Might I call upon you this evening after dark? I know this sounds melodramatic, but I dare not be seen visiting you openly. There are those who would not wish me to speak. T. Vera Thornton." Miss Marple read the letter twice, noting the shaky script, The ink blots that suggested the writer's hand had trembled. "There are those who would not wish me to speak." A suggestive phrase, that. She spent the remainder of the afternoon in apparent domesticity, deadheading roses and discussing the church fete with the vicar's wife. But her mind was elsewhere, sorting through possibilities like a card sharp arranging a deck. At 8:30, as the summer twilight deepened into true darkness, a soft tapping came at the kitchen door. Miss Marple, who had been expecting it, opened the door to reveal Vera Thornton, wrapped in a dark cloak despite the warm evening. "Come in, my dear." In the gentle lamplight of Miss Marple's sitting room, Vera's distress was even more apparent. She perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands gripping her reticule as though it were a lifeline. "I don't know where to begin," she whispered. "The beginning is usually best," Miss Marple said kindly, settling into her chair. Vera's eyes widened. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Vera spoke, her voice barely audible. "The tonic. Mrs. Ashworth's evening tonic. It wasn't where it should have been yesterday afternoon. I always keep it in the medicine cabinet in her dressing room, but when I went to fetch it at 6 o'clock, it was gone. I found it later on the table in the drawing room. How could I? They would think, they would assume—" Vera's composure crumbled. "Miss Marple, I prepared Mrs. Ashworth's tonic every evening. Always the same dosage, always the same time. If it was poisoned, the police will naturally suspect me. I had access, I had opportunity." She hesitated, then continued in a rush. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Mrs. Ashworth discovered something about my past. Something I had concealed when I took the position. She confronted me 3 days ago, threatened to dismiss me without references. Without references, Miss Marple, I would be ruined." Vera's face flushed with shame. "My previous employer, a gentleman in Surrey, he made certain advances. When I refused, he dismissed me, claiming I had stolen from him. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but who would believe a companion over a gentleman? Mrs. Ashworth somehow learned of it. Where else could I go? I have no family, no resources." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "But now she's dead, and I know how it looks." Miss Marple handed her a handkerchief and waited while the younger woman composed herself. When Vera finally looked up, there was a desperate hope in her eyes. "You believe me, don't you, Miss Marple? I swear to you, I did not poison her." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "Fear could make people tell the truth, or it could make them lie very convincingly. The question was, which was Vera Thornton doing?" The morning brought rain, a soft, persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror the mood of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, having spent a largely sleepless night turning over the puzzle of Vera Thornton's revelation, was surprised to find Captain Hargreaves standing at her door before breakfast, his military bearing somewhat diminished by the damp. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, water dripping from his hat brim. "I understand Slack intends to arrest me this afternoon." She ushered him into her sitting room, noting the grey pallor of his face, the slight tremor in his hands as he removed his sodden coat. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the night wrestling with his conscience, and found himself thoroughly defeated. "I did not kill Lydia Ashworth," he said once they were seated, "but I had reason to wish her ill, and I cannot prove my whereabouts at the time of her death. Worse still, I behaved like a fool yesterday, going white at that cursed music box." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point only he could see. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old sorrows. "I heard that melody once before, many years ago. In India, in 1898. I was a young lieutenant then, stationed in Simla." His smile was bitter. Her name was Margaret Ashworth. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythmic dance. "I was not aware, Mrs. No one here knew. Margaret died in India, you see, and Lydia never spoke of her." He drew a shaky breath. "We were engaged to be married, Margaret and I. She was lovely, so full of life and laughter. But she was also reckless. There was another man, a civilian administrator with more money and prospects than a junior officer could offer. It had been her mother's, brought out from England. Margaret kept it in her sitting room. The day she told me our engagement was finished, that box was playing that same haunting melody." His hands clenched. 3 months after her marriage, Margaret took her own life. Poison. They said it was an accident, a tragic confusion of medicines, but I knew better. She had written to me, you see, confessing her unhappiness, begging me to, but I had already been transferred to Delhi. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows with increased urgency. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch, understanding that some confessions required space to breathe. "Lydia blamed me," he continued, "said I had broken Margaret's heart, driven her to desperation. We had a terrible confrontation at the funeral. She swore she would never forgive me, that I had destroyed her beloved sister. When I returned to England after my retirement and settled here, purely by coincidence, I assure you, she was already established at Ashworth House. That puzzled me as well. The invitation arrived a fortnight ago, quite unexpected." He shrugged helplessly. "One cannot hide forever from one's past. Yes, though I don't believe she knew of its significance to me. How could she? The expression on her face when she played it was one of innocent pleasure, not malice." He met Miss Marple's gaze directly. "But Slack will not believe that." The word was firm, unwavering. "Whatever my feelings toward Lydia Ashworth, and they were complicated, I'll grant you, I did not kill her. I left the party at 5:30 and went directly home. My housekeeper had the evening off, so there is no one to verify my statement. I spent the evening alone, reading and then sleeping." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking thoughtfully. "Tell me, Captain, during the time you were at the party, did you notice anything unusual?" He considered the question carefully. Young Forrester seemed particularly attentive to Miss Angela. At one point, I saw them in quite intense conversation by the greenhouse. She appeared distressed, and he was speaking urgently, though I could not hear what was said. And there was a moment when Mrs. Ashworth drew Miss Thornton aside. The companion, you know, Mrs. Shortly before I departed. This aligned with Vera's account of being confronted about her past, Miss Marple noted, but it also suggested that others might have witnessed the exchange, might have understood that Vera had reason to fear her employer. "One more thing," the captain added, rising to leave. "Dr. Haydock was there longer than most guests. I noticed him slip into the house around 5:30, looking rather secretive. He emerged perhaps 10 minutes later, looking flushed and agitated. I thought it odd at the time, but dismissed it. After his departure, Miss Marple sat in contemplation. The picture was becoming clearer, yet also more complicated. Captain Hargreaves, despite his connection to the past and his reaction to the music box, did not strike her as a murderer. His grief over Margaret Ashworth seemed genuine, and genuine grief rarely transformed into murderous vengeance after 3 decades. But Dr. Haydock, young, attentive to Angela, and apparently conducting some secret business in the house during the party. That was interesting indeed. The telephone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Colonel Melchett, his voice urgent. "Miss Marple, thought you should know. We've examined that tonic bottle. It contained enough digitalis to kill 3 people. But here's the curious thing. Haydock says it would have required access to pure pharmaceutical digitalis, not just foxglove plants." "I see," Miss Marple said slowly. "Well, a doctor would naturally. And a pharmacist." He paused significantly. "Anyone who had worked in a hospital or medical facility." Miss Thornton's references mentioned a brief period as a voluntary aide during the war. After the call ended, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the rain blur the familiar landscape of St. Mary Mead into impressionistic shapes. Somewhere in this village, a murderer was going about their daily business, confident in their cleverness. But murderers, in Miss Marple's experience, always made the mistakes. The question was, which mistake would reveal this one? The rain had cleared by afternoon, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. Miss Marple was trimming her roses when she observed Angela Ashworth making her way uncertainly along the high street, a wrapped parcel clutched to her chest. The girl's movements were hesitant, almost furtive, and when she caught sight of Miss Marple, she seemed to freeze like a startled deer. "Good afternoon, Miss Ashworth," Miss Marple called gently, setting down her secateurs. Angela approached the garden gate with visible reluctance. Up close, she looked even more fragile than usual, her eyes red-rimmed and darkly shadowed. She had the appearance of someone who had not slept properly in days. "Miss Marple, I wondered if I might speak with you." The words tumbled out in a rush, tinged with desperation. "Of course, my dear. Come inside." In the comfortable sanctuary of Miss Marple's sitting room, Angela perched on the edge of the sofa, still clutching her parcel. Miss Marple busied herself with the tea things, allowing the silence to work its particular magic. In her experience, young people often needed time to gather courage before unburdening themselves. "They're saying Captain Hargreaves killed her," Angela finally whispered. "Inspector Slack was at the house this morning, asking more questions." Angela's fingers worried at the string binding her parcel. I don't know anything anymore." She looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "Miss Marple, I've done something dreadful. Not murder, I swear it, but something that might." The girl's resolve seemed to crumble. "It's about Dennis, Mr. Forrester, Aunt Lydia's nephew. We've been in love for over a year now. Secret love, because Aunt Lydia would never have approved. She thought him frivolous, unsuitable. She had other plans for me, Dr. Haydock specifically." Miss Marple poured the tea, her expression neutral. "Doctor?" "Yes, and that's part of the problem. He proposed to me a month ago. I refused, of course, but he wouldn't accept my answer. He kept pressing, kept insisting we were perfectly suited." She hesitated, not violent exactly, but intense, angry. "And do you?" Angela's chin lifted with a flash of defiance. Completely. Dennis loves me for myself, not for what I might inherit. But Aunt Lydia discovered our attachment 3 weeks ago. She was furious. She called Dennis to her solicitor's office and told him that if we persisted in this foolishness, she would disinherit me entirely. It was awful. Dennis was so angry, not with me, but with her. He said terrible things, said she was a vindictive old woman who wanted to control everyone around her. Angela's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And now she's dead, and Dennis has no alibi for that evening. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. He was here, in St. Mary Mead. The confession emerged in a torrent, as though Angela had been holding it back with all her strength and could no longer maintain the dam. He telephoned me after he supposedly left for London. Asked me to meet him in the village by the old mill at 7 o'clock. Yes, he was agitated, pacing back and forth. He said he'd had another terrible argument with Aunt Lydia, that she'd given him an ultimatum. Break off our understanding completely, or she would ruin him professionally. She had connections, you see, in the advertising world. Angela's hands twisted in her lap. He wanted me to elope with him, that very night. He had it all planned. We would drive to Gretna Green, marry, and present Aunt Lydia with a fait accompli. I couldn't do it. Not like that, in secret and haste, as though we were doing something shameful. I told him we should wait, give Aunt Lydia time to reconsider. He became, well, not angry with me, but frustrated. She met Miss Marple's gaze. We argued for perhaps 20 minutes, and then he left. He said he was going back to London after all, that he needed to think. How can I? It would make him look guilty. And he isn't. I know he isn't. Dennis would never. But her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, her gaze distant. Miss Ashworth, you must understand that withholding information from the police in a murder investigation is a serious matter. Whatever your feelings for Mr. Angela's voice broke. Miss Marple turned back to face her. Tell me, did anyone else know about your meeting with Mr. Angela's expression shifted, became troubled. I'm not certain, but as I was walking to the mill, I thought I saw someone in the shadows near the church. Just a glimpse, you understand, and I couldn't swear to it. Did Mr. Forrester mention having been in the house that evening? No, he said he'd been waiting in the village since 6 o'clock. He was quite emphatic about not going back to Ashworth House. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the care of a jeweller examining a gem for flaws. Something here didn't quite align, didn't quite make sense. My dear, she said gently, I think you must tell Inspector Slack what you've told me. Withholding evidence will only make matters worse. If Mr. Forrester is innocent, the truth will ultimately prove it. She left the thought unfinished. Angela departed shortly thereafter. Her parcel, which had turned out to contain some of her aunt's jewelry she'd been asked to identify, still clutched in her arms. Miss Marple watched her go, then returned to her sitting room to think. Dennis Forrester had lied about his whereabouts. But was it the lie of a murderer, or merely the lie of a young man trying to protect himself from suspicion? And who had been watching Angela that evening? Someone who knew about their assignation? Someone who might use that knowledge to their advantage? The music box, she thought suddenly. It all came back to that curious object with its macabre legend. Someone had moved the tonic bottle near it. Someone had wanted it found there. But why? Dr. Haydock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage that evening without appointment or invitation, his usually genial face drawn and troubled. He stood on her doorstep with the air of a man who had exhausted all other options and found himself driven to an uncomfortable necessity. "I hope I'm not intruding," he began, though his presence suggested he would stay regardless of her answer. "I find myself in need of, well, advice, I suppose." Miss Marple, who had been expecting some such visit ever since Captain Hargreaves's revelation about the doctor's furtive behavior at the party, ushered him inside without comment. She observed the way his hands moved restlessly, the tightness around his eyes, the general aspect of a man carrying a burden he could no longer bear alone. She suggested. He accepted the glass with a nod of gratitude and drank deeply before speaking. When he did, the words emerged with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed them extensively, yet still found them difficult to voice. "I was in love with Lydia Ashworth," he said bluntly. "Have been for nearly 2 years. Not Angela, Lydia herself." Whatever Miss Marple had expected, it was not this. She kept her expression neutral, merely nodding encouragement for him to continue. "I know how it must sound. I'm 32, she was 55, but age had nothing to do with it. She was remarkable, intelligent, cultured, still beautiful in her way. We shared interests in literature, in music. Her husband had been dead 3 years when I returned to take over my father's practice, and she seemed—" He set down his glass and began to pace, unable to remain still. It began innocently enough. Professional visits that became friendly calls. Conversations that stretched long into the evening. I fell completely hopelessly in love with her. Oh, she enjoyed my company, made that clear enough. His laugh was bitter. 3 months ago, I finally worked up courage to propose. Not in any romantic fashion. I knew her well enough to avoid melodrama. She was kind about it, which somehow made it worse. Said she valued my friendship too highly to risk it with matrimony. That she had no intention of ever remarrying. That her independence was too precious. He stopped pacing and faced Miss Marple directly. But we couldn't, of course. How could we? Every time I saw her afterward, it was agony. The word exploded from him. It was torture. Angela is a sweet girl, but she's a child compared to Lydia. And she was clearly attached to that wastrel Forrester, though she tried to hide it. He resumed his seat, his shoulders slumping. At the garden party, I did something unforgivable. You see, I had recently learned something about Dennis Forrester. A former patient of mine, a young woman in London, came to visit her family here. She recognized Forrester's name when I mentioned him in conversation. Told me he was already engaged to another woman, a wealthy widow he'd been courting for months. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. I did. Made discreet inquiries through a colleague in London. It was true. Forrester had indeed been seen frequently with this woman, and gossip suggested an understanding between them. Yes, that's what your Captain Hargreaves saw, I suppose. I found Lydia in her study and told her everything. I expected her to be grateful to see that I was protecting Angela. His voice dropped. She accused me of spying, of trying to manipulate her through Angela. Said I was attempting to eliminate Forrester as a rival so I could pursue Angela without competition. Or perhaps understood them better than you realize, Miss Marple suggested quietly. He flinched. Perhaps. In any case, we argued. She ordered me from the house, said she would make her own inquiries about Forrester's character and decide what was best for Angela without my interference. Vera Thornton passed me in the hallway. She looked frightened, actually. I suppose she'd overheard our raised voices. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind working rapidly. Doctor, I must ask you a direct question. His shock appeared genuine. I loved her, Miss Marple. Despite everything, despite her rejection and her later cruelty, I loved her. He covered his face with his hands. But I understand why I'm under suspicion. I had motive. Rejection, humiliation, anger. I had opportunity. I was in the house during the crucial hours. And I have access to pharmaceutical digitalis. Not yet. But he will. He looked up, his eyes haunted. That's why I came to you. I know your reputation, Miss Marple. You see things others miss. I'm asking you, begging you, to believe I'm innocent. The truth is the only thing that will help you, Doctor. She regarded him thoughtfully. Tell me, when you were in Mrs. Ashworth's study, did you notice anything unusual? He considered the question. The desk was cluttered, more than usual. She'd been going through papers, legal documents, I think, and there was a photograph lying face down on the blotter. I thought it odd, but didn't examine it. Dennis Forrester was coming in through the garden entrance as I was leaving through the front. We didn't speak, but he looked furtive, guilty almost. After the doctor's departure, Miss Marple sat in the gathering darkness, her knitting forgotten in her lap. 3 people now had confessed to being in or near Ashworth House during the crucial hours, all with motives, all with secrets. Captain Hargreaves, burdened by old guilt. Dennis Forrester, threatened with ruin. Dr. Haydock, rejected and humiliated. And yet, something felt wrong about all of it. The pieces fit too neatly, like a puzzle deliberately constructed to confuse rather than clarify. She thought again of the music box, of its legendary warning. It plays only when someone is about to die. But who had really played it? And more importantly, who had heard it play? Miss Marple spent the following morning in what might have appeared to casual observers as idle gossip, but which was in fact a carefully orchestrated intelligence-gathering operation. Her first call was upon Miss Hartnell, the village's unofficial historian and repository of local knowledge stretching back 40 years. Miss Hartnell settled into her chair with the satisfied air of one about to deliver a lecture. Oh, I knew them when they first came to St. Mary Mead. That would be 1920, just after the war. Edmund Ashworth was in shipping, did very well out of the war contracts, I understand. I wasn't aware of that, Miss Marple murmured, though her needles never faltered in their rhythm. Oh yes, the first Mrs. Ashworth died in India. Some sort of tragedy, I believe, though Edmund never spoke of it. He married Lydia barely a year later. She'd been a widow herself, quite young, with a small daughter. Not at all. Her real name is Angela Hartley. Her father was killed in the Boer War when she was just an infant. When Lydia married Edmund Ashworth, he adopted Angela legally, gave her his name, treated her as his own by all accounts. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. And Dennis Forrester, Edmund's nephew, son of his only sister. Bit of a disappointment to the family, I gather. Never settled to any proper profession. His mother died when he was young, and Edmund paid for his education, set him up in London. After leaving Miss Hartnell's cottage, Miss Marple made her way to the village library, housed in a converted Georgian townhouse. Mrs. Bantry, whose husband owned Gossington Hall, was just emerging with an armful of murder mysteries. "Jane, just the person I wanted to see. Have you heard the latest? Inspector Slack has arrested Dennis Forrester." Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though inwardly she felt a tremor of concern. Angela finally told him about their meeting the night of the murder, and it seems Forrester's alibi for the London dinner was false. The restaurant has no record of his reservation, and none of his supposed companions can confirm they saw him. Prostrate, naturally. Dr. Haydock had to sedate her. Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I'm not entirely convinced either. Dennis Forrester is weak and selfish, certainly, but a murderer?" Miss Marple made a non-committal sound. In her experience, murder was often committed by those who seemed least capable of it. Desperation made people surprisingly resourceful. She spent the afternoon in apparent tranquility, tending her garden and receiving visits from various villagers eager to discuss the arrest. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over facts like a scholar examining ancient texts for hidden meanings. At 4 o'clock, she did something unusual. She telephoned Messrs. Grice and Packington, the solicitors in Much Benham, and requested a meeting with Mr. Grice himself. That gentleman, somewhat surprised but too polite to refuse, agreed to see her at 5 o'clock. Mr. Grice was an elderly man with the dusty, precise manner of one who has spent a lifetime among legal documents. He received Miss Marple in his wood-panelled office with courteous curiosity. "I understand you handled Mrs. Ashworth's affairs," Miss Marple began. "I wonder if you might tell me something of her recent testamentary arrangements." Mr. Grice's expression became guarded. "Of course. But surely you can confirm whether substantial changes were made recently. It's a matter of general knowledge in the village that there were—" He sighed, recognizing the futility of stonewalling a determined elderly lady. "Very well. Yes, Mrs. Ashworth made significant changes to her will 3 weeks ago. The previous version left the bulk of her estate to Miss Angela Hartley, with generous bequests to Mr. Butty, reversed much of that. Miss Angela was to receive only a modest trust fund, enough to live comfortably but not lavishly. The remainder was divided between several medical charities and a trust for the preservation of historical properties. Mr. Forrester was left £100. Nothing at all? Mrs. Ashworth was quite emphatic on that point. She said Miss Thornton had forfeited any claim to her generosity through Mr. Forrester, certainly. Mrs. Ashworth made the changes in his presence, after what I understand was a rather heated argument. He paused, then added, "And Miss Angela knew as well. Mrs. Ashworth told her the evening before the garden party." Miss Marple absorbed this information with care. "One final question, Mr. Grice. Had Mrs. Ashworth given any indication she might change the will again?" "Not to me." He hesitated. "She did telephone the day before her death. Asked me to prepare documentation for a codicil." "No." The walk back to St. Mary Mead took Miss Marple through the fading afternoon light, past fields where shadows grew long and darkness gathered in the hedgerows. Her mind was a whirl of information, pieces gradually arranging themselves into a pattern. Mrs. Ashworth had changed her will, disinheriting those who had expected to benefit. Then, just before her death, she had contemplated changing it again. Had someone known? Had someone acted to prevent further alterations? And yet, something still nagged at her. Some details she had overlooked or misinterpreted. She thought of the music box playing in the evening, of the tonic bottle found near it, of all the various people who had been in or near the house that night. As she reached her cottage gate, she stopped abruptly, struck by a sudden realization. The music box. Everyone had assumed it played by itself, fulfilling its macabre legend. But what if that wasn't true? What if someone had deliberately played it, wanting witnesses to hear it, wanting to establish the legend as fact? And if so, why? Miss Marple presented herself at Ashworth House the following morning with a basket of seedlings ostensibly intended for Angela. Inspector Slack, who was still conducting his investigation on the premises, regarded her appearance with his customary mixture of suspicion and resignation. "I suppose there's no keeping you away," he grumbled. "Though I'll have you know the case is solved. Forrester had motive, opportunity, and no alibi." "Indeed, Inspector. Still, I wonder if I might examine the music box once more." Slack's expression suggested he found this typical of elderly women and their peculiar interests, but he accompanied her to the drawing room where the box remained on its marble table, now marked with police chalk and labelled as evidence. "Don't touch it," he warned. "We've already dusted for fingerprints." Miss Marple bent close, her keen eyes examining every surface. The lacquer gleamed in the morning light, the gold leaf tracery catching and reflecting the sun. She studied the scratches she had noticed before, then turned her attention to the base of the box. "I'd like to examine something." With obvious reluctance, Slack produced a penknife. Miss Marple, with surprising dexterity for her age, carefully worked at a small section of the decorative base. After a moment's manipulation, a tiny panel clicked open, revealing a hidden compartment. Slack leaned forward, his skepticism transforming into interest. Inside the compartment lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, and something else, a small brass mechanism, clearly modern, with what appeared to be a timer attached. Miss Marple carefully extracted the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the ink faded but still legible. She read aloud, "This box belonged to my daughter Margaret, who died by her own hand in Simla, 1898. May God forgive her despair and my failure to protect her." A heavy silence filled the room. Slack cleared his throat. "So the box did belong to the sister, the one who died in India." Miss Marple turned her attention to the brass mechanism. "But this, Inspector, is far more recent. This is a simple timing device, the sort one might purchase from any shop dealing in clockwork mechanisms." Precisely. The legend of the music box playing before a death wasn't supernatural at all. She looked up at Slack. Before Slack could respond, Vera Thornton appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "I did," she said quietly. "I discovered it by accident 2 days after the box arrived. I was dusting it, and the panel clicked open. I found the note but said nothing. It seemed too personal, too tragic. But there was no mechanism then, I swear it." Vera's hands twisted together. "I told Mrs. Ashworth." She read the note and became very agitated. Said it explained certain things about her husband's past, things she'd wondered about. She made me promise not to mention it to anyone, especially not to Captain Hargreaves or Angela. 4 days before the garden party, Mrs. Ashworth spent the next day locked in her study going through old papers. That evening she summoned Miss Marple, exchanged a glance with Inspector Slack. "Did Mrs. Ashworth seem frightened?" "Both, I think." The sound of footsteps announced Colonel Melchett's arrival, slightly breathless. "Slack, Miss Marple. You'll want to hear this. We've been conducting further inquiries in London about Forrester's alibi. Turns out he was telling the truth about one thing. He did intend to have dinner at the Savoy that evening. Slack demanded. Edmund Ashworth's. Melchett paused. But here's the interesting part. The restaurant confirms a reservation for E. Ashworth at 8 o'clock that evening. They can't say for certain. The maitre d' remembers a gentleman in evening dress. Tall, well-built, claiming to be Ashworth. Dined alone, paid in cash, and left around 10. Miss Marple felt a small thrill of recognition, pieces sliding into place with satisfying precision. Inspector Slack, I wonder, might we examine Mrs. Ashworth's study? The study was a small book-lined room at the back of the house, its desk still covered with the papers Mrs. Ashworth had been examining. Miss Marple studied them with methodical care. Old letters, legal documents, and most interesting, a series of bank statements from a Calcutta bank, dated 1898. Look at these transactions, she said, pointing. Throughout 1898, increasing in amount as the year progressed. Slack muttered. Or, Miss Marple said softly, it could be Margaret Hargreaves. Her married name. Had she married Captain Hargreaves as planned? You're suggesting Edmund Ashworth was paying someone? Or support? Miss Marple straightened, her expression troubled. I believe Mrs. Ashworth discovered something in these papers, something that made her realize her late husband had been keeping a significant secret. Something connected to his sister Margaret's death. Slack scratched his head. But we've arrested Forrester. He had motive, he lied about his whereabouts, and yet someone else was using his reservation at the Savoy. Miss Marple interrupted gently. Someone who wanted to be seen in London while Mrs. Ashworth died in St. Mary Mead. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Inspector, I believe we may have arrested the wrong person. The revelation that someone had impersonated Dennis Forrester at the Savoy sent Inspector Slack into a flurry of activity, issuing orders and demanding telephone connections to Scotland Yard. Miss Marple, meanwhile, requested permission to speak privately with Angela, who had been sedated and confined to her room since Forrester's arrest. The girl lay propped against pillows, her fair hair limp against the embroidered linen. Her eyes, when they opened at Miss Marple's entrance, held the glazed quality of someone who had retreated from unbearable reality into chemical oblivion. Miss Marple, she whispered, have they released Dennis? Not yet, my dear. Miss Marple settled into the chair beside the bed. I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to think very carefully before answering. Angela struggled to sit up, some spark of alertness returning to her eyes. Anything? Yes, she was terribly upset. She came to my room that evening. This would be 4 days before the party, and she was almost frantic. Angela's brow furrowed with the effort of memory. Not entirely. She was speaking in fragments, not making complete sense. She said something about Margaret Hargreaves not being who everyone thought she was. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And then she said something very strange. She said, he isn't even who he claims to be. I asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't say more. Miss Marple sat very still, her mind racing. Angela, I need you to think back to when you were a child. Of course, he was very kind to me, always. When he married Mamma, I was only 4 years old. Rarely. She said he'd been a military man, died in South Africa. Angela's expression became puzzled. Why are you asking about this? Miss Marple rose. Rest now. She found Vera Thornton in the morning room, staring vacantly out the window. The companion turned at Miss Marple's entrance, her face a mask of misery. They're saying I might be arrested next, Vera said dully. Inspector Slack believes I'm an accomplice. That I helped Mr. Forrester poison Mrs. No, I've told them repeatedly. I had nothing to do with it. Yes, I was desperate. Yes, I feared being dismissed without references. She broke off, tears streaming down her face. No one believes me. Miss Marple's expression softened with sympathy. Vera, I need to ask you something. In all your time with Mrs. Ashworth, did you ever see her act strangely around Captain Hargreaves? Vera wiped her eyes, considering. Now that you mention it, yes. The first time Captain Hargreaves called at the house, this was about 6 months ago, just a social visit. Miss Ashworth went absolutely white when she saw him. She recovered quickly, was perfectly civil, but after he left she locked herself in her study for hours. When she emerged she looked, no, but she asked me the oddest question. She wanted to know if I thought people could change so much over time that they became unrecognizable. Miss Marple thanked her and made her way to the library, where she found Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack poring over documents spread across the massive oak table. Ah, Miss Marple, Melchett greeted her. We've been looking into Edmund Ashworth's background. Turns out there are some curious gaps in his history. Before he appeared in London in 1898 and established his shipping business, there's virtually no record of him. That's not uncommon for self-made men, Slack objected. True, Melchett conceded. And the timing of his marriage to Lydia, it raises questions. And there's something else. We've been trying to locate records of Margaret Ashworth's death in India. The official record says suicide by poison, but we found a notation in the margin. Identity confirmed by brother E. Miss Marple felt the final pieces clicking into place with crystalline clarity. Gentlemen, she said quietly, I believe I understand what happened, but to prove it, I'll need your cooperation and Captain Hargreaves's presence. Slack looked skeptical. Because, Miss Marple said, I believe he is the only person who can identify the true murderer. Within the hour, Captain Hargreaves arrived, confused but cooperative. Miss Marple arranged for everyone to gather in the drawing room. Angela, Vera, Dr. Haydock, Colonel Melchett, and Inspector Slack. The music box sat on its table like a silent witness. Captain Hargreaves, Miss Marple began, I'd like you to look at something. Angela, would you fetch that photograph of your mother's first husband? Angela, mystified, departed and returned moments later with a small silver frame. She handed it to Captain Hargreaves, whose face went absolutely rigid as he stared at the faded image. Good God, he breathed. That's impossible. This is Lieutenant Thomas Hartley. We served together in India. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet, according to records, Thomas Hartley married Lydia and fathered Angela before his death in South Africa in 1899. Captain, I believe you've just identified a ghost. The room erupted in confusion, but Miss Marple raised her hand for silence. I believe, she said, that Edmund Ashworth was not who he claimed to be, and Lydia Ashworth discovered the truth just days before her death. The drawing room had fallen into a stunned silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Captain Hargreaves remained frozen, the photograph trembling in his hands, while Angela stared at Miss Marple, with incomprehension. "I don't understand," Angela whispered. "Are you saying Uncle Edmund wasn't really Uncle Edmund?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the man known as Edmund Ashworth was actually someone else entirely." Dr. Haydock leaned forward. "But why? What possible reason?" "Money," interrupted Colonel Melchett grimly. "It's always money, isn't it? Edmund Ashworth inherited a considerable fortune from his father in 1897. "But Margaret Ashworth," Captain Hargreaves said hoarsely, "she would have known her own brother." Miss Marple's expression grew sad. "Captain, I don't believe she was deceived. I believe she was complicit." "In the Calcutta Bank?" Slack's voice was skeptical. "Because she was desperate," Miss Marple replied. "You told me yourself, Captain, that she broke your engagement to marry a wealthy man. But what if that marriage was unhappy? What if she found herself trapped, in need of money to escape?" Vera Thornton spoke up suddenly. "The suicide. I think Margaret Ashworth became a liability. Once the impersonation was established, once Edmund Ashworth had claimed the inheritance and begun building his business empire, Margaret's continued existence was a threat. She could expose him at any moment." The room erupted in agitated conversation. Inspector Slack demanded evidence, while Angela dissolved into tears. Only Captain Hargreaves remained silent, his weathered face working through emotions too complex to name. "This is all very well," Slack finally said, "but Edmund Ashworth died 3 years ago." "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "Lydia discovered the truth. The note in the music box, the bank records, they led her to understand that her husband had been an impostor. But I believe she discovered something even more damaging." The silence that followed was absolute. "That's madness," Dr. Haydock said. "I signed the death certificate myself." Miss Marple turned to him. "You were newly established in your practice then, weren't you, Doctor? Called to attend a patient you'd never treated before?" Melchett consulted his notes. "It was, at the family's request." Miss Marple nodded. "How convenient. No possibility of exhumation, no way to verify identity. Gentlemen, I believe Edmund Ashworth, or whoever he really was, staged his own death 3 years ago. He'd amassed a fortune, but perhaps he felt the deception growing too dangerous, too difficult to maintain." "But the will," Angela protested. "Everything came to Aunt Lydia, with provisions for me." "Because he couldn't take it with him, not without raising suspicions. But what if he planned to recover it later, through an intermediary?" "Dennis Forrester," Slack said triumphantly. "That's why he was so keen on the inheritance, why he was courting Angela." "No," Miss Marple interrupted firmly. "Dennis Forrester is weak and venal, but he's not a murderer. And he's certainly not Edmund Ashworth's accomplice. Think, Inspector. Who else stood to inherit substantially under the original will? Who had access to the house, to Mrs. The realization dawned on multiple faces simultaneously. Vera Thornton went white as parchment. "No," she whispered. "No, you can't mean—" "Captain Hargreaves," Miss Marple said gently, "I'd like you to look at the photograph again, not at Thomas Hartley, but at the man standing beside him in the background." Hargreaves squinted at the faded image, then suddenly stiffened. "Good God, that's... But it can't be. The build is similar, the height, but the face. 30 years of comfortable living changes a man," Miss Marple observed. "Adds weight, softens features. And a man who's already assumed 2 identities might find a third relatively simple, especially if he's patient. 2 years, Captain. 2 years of living quietly in St. Dr. Haydock rose to his feet, his face suddenly drained of colour. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," she said, meeting his eyes directly, "that you are not Dr. James Haydock. That the real doctor—" The room erupted in chaos. Slack lunged forward, but Haydock was already moving, his hand diving into his medical bag. He emerged with a small pistol, backing toward the French windows. "Very clever, Miss Marple," he said, his voice suddenly different, harder, colder, stripped of its genial facade. "Though not quite clever enough. You have theories but no proof." "We have the timing device from the music box," Miss Marple said calmly. "I noticed you wore a distinctive cologne, Doctor." His face twisted. "Lydia was a fool. She invited me to her study, showed me what she'd discovered, asked if I could explain it, said she wanted to understand before she went to the police." His laugh was bitter. "I'd built 3 lives, 3 fortunes." "So you poisoned her tonic," Miss Marple continued. "Set the music box to play and establish the legend." "It should have worked," he snarled. "It would have worked if you hadn't—" But he never finished the sentence. Captain Hargreaves, moving with surprising speed for a man of his age, tackled him from behind. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as both men crashed to the floor, and Inspector Slack rushed forward with his handcuffs. The evening sun cast long shadows across Miss Marple's sitting room, where she had gathered the principal parties involved in the case. Dennis Forrester, released from custody that afternoon, sat beside Angela, their hands clasped tightly. Captain Hargreaves occupied the chair by the window, his expression still bearing traces of shock. Vera Thornton perched nervously on the sofa, while Colonel Melchett stood by the fireplace, his notebook at the ready. "I believe," Miss Marple began, pouring tea with steady hands, "that you all deserve a complete explanation." She settled into her chair, her knitting basket beside her, though her hands remained idle. Margaret was in love with Captain Hargreaves, but she was also ambitious and dissatisfied with the prospect of an officer's modest income. When her brother Edmund inherited the family fortune, she saw an opportunity, not for herself directly, but through association. However, her brother had little interest in supporting her extravagant lifestyle. Then came the man we knew as Doctor. Angela asked, her voice still tremulous. His true identity may never be fully known. I suspect he was a confidence man, perhaps a failed officer, or a clerk with enough education to pass himself off as various people. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Vera with a gracious nod before continuing. The scheme was elegant in its way. Edmund Ashworth was unmarried, somewhat reclusive, and had just inherited a fortune. Our impostor bore a passing resemblance to him, enough that with Margaret's cooperation he could assume Edmund's identity. The real Edmund Ashworth disappeared, quite possibly murdered, though we may never prove it, Melchett interjected. Yes, but Margaret became unstable, perhaps guilty over her complicity. The false Edmund couldn't risk her confession, so he arranged her death to look like suicide. Hargreaves nodded heavily. I burned the letter years ago, unable to bear keeping it. But yes, she spoke of being trapped, of knowing terrible secrets. I thought she meant her unhappy marriage. After Margaret's death, our impostor was free to claim the Ashworth fortune completely. He married Lydia, who was genuinely Thomas Hartley's widow, and gained both respectability and access to another identity he'd stolen. For 20 years, he lived as Edmund Ashworth, growing wealthier, more established. Then, 3 years ago, he sensed danger. Perhaps he feared discovery, or simply grew tired of the deception. But he came back, Dennis said, his voice tight with anger. As Doctor? Indeed, the real Dr. Haydock, the elder Dr. Haydock's son, had been practicing in Cornwall. Our impostor somehow encountered him, perhaps as a patient, and recognized an opportunity. A man of the right age and profession, returning to take over his aging father's practice in a village where few would remember what he'd looked like as a boy. The real doctor. Vera shuddered. He's been treating us all this time. Yes, and it gave him the perfect cover to monitor his former family. He could watch Lydia, ensure she suspected nothing. He could court Angela, not for love, but to eventually reclaim the fortune through marriage. Angela asked. Because the music box arrived, Miss Marple said quietly, with its hidden compartment and Edmund Ashworth's note about Margaret's death. When Lydia discovered it and began investigating, he knew she would eventually uncover the truth. She'd already found the bank records showing the payments to Margaret. She confronted him, Melchett said. Not quite a confrontation. She didn't yet realize the full truth. She asked him as her trusted physician to help her make sense of what she'd discovered. She showed him the evidence, asked his opinion. Miss Marple's expression grew somber. He realized she was dangerously close to exposing him. He already had access to her home, her routines, her medications. The tonic, Vera whispered. He must have poisoned it when he was in the house during the party. Yes, he likely doctored it during his supposed examination of Mrs. Ashworth, or perhaps during one of his furtive movements through the house. Then he set the timing device in the music box to play that evening, knowing witnesses would hear it and speak of the legend. Dennis asked. He used your reservation, Dennis, knowing you'd be suspected. A man of his height and build, in evening dress, presenting himself as E. Ashworth. A delicious irony, using his old stolen name one final time. He dined, established his presence in London, and returned to St. Captain Hargreaves spoke, his voice rough with emotion. All those years, I blamed myself for Margaret's death. Thought I'd driven her to suicide by not being wealthy enough, exciting enough. Margaret made terrible choices, Miss Marple said gently, but she didn't deserve her fate. She turned to Angela. My dear, you must not blame yourself for loving Dennis or for not seeing through Dr. Haydock's facade. Angela wiped her eyes. He'll stand trial, Melchett said firmly. With Miss Marple's testimony and the evidence we've gathered, the cologne on the timing device, the fingerprints, the testimony from the Savoy, we have a solid case. And we'll be investigating the deaths of the real Edmund Ashworth and the real Dr. Haydock. As the gathering broke up, Dennis and Angela departing with new understanding between them, and the others making their various ways home, Captain Hargreaves lingered. "Miss Marple," he said, "how did you know?" She smiled her gentle smile. "Small things, Captain. The way he reacted when told about the music box legend. Not with skepticism as a medical man should, but with calculation. The way he inserted himself into the investigation, always present, always helpful. And most tellingly, the cologne. It's quite distinctive. I recognized it from years ago, when Edmund Ashworth was alive. The same scent after all these years. Vanity, Captain." 3 weeks had passed since the arrest of the man who had called himself Dr. Haydock. Autumn had begun its gentle invasion of St. Mary Mead, touching the leaves with gold and sending the swallows southward. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a particularly fine September afternoon, her knitting progressing steadily, when she received an unexpected visitor. Angela Ashworth, though she had quietly resumed her birth name of Hartley, arrived carrying a familiar lacquered box. She looked transformed from the fragile, nervous creature of midsummer. There was colour in her cheeks and a steadiness in her bearing that spoke of someone who had passed through fire and emerged stronger for it. "Not at all, my dear. Come, sit." Angela settled onto the garden bench, the music box resting in her lap. "I wanted to thank you properly, and to bring you this. The police released it yesterday, now that the trial preparations are complete." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Dispose of it. Are you certain?" "It's cursed," Angela said simply. "Oh, I know there's no supernatural element. You proved that conclusively. But it's brought nothing but sorrow to my family. Margaret died because of the secrets it represented. Aunt Lydia died because of what she discovered through it." Miss Marple reached out and gently touched the lacquered surface. "Though I confess, I've always believed objects themselves are neutral. Perhaps." Angela opened the lid, and the familiar melody began to play, haunting and beautiful in the September sunshine. "Dennis and I are to be married next month. A quiet ceremony, nothing elaborate. A fitting memorial," Miss Marple approved. "I've been researching her, the real her, not the stories I was told. Lydia married my father, Thomas Hartley, when she was very young. He was genuinely good to her, by all accounts, before he died in South Africa. She was a young widow with a baby when she met the man she believed was Edmund Ashworth. She had no reason to suspect he was an impostor." The music box wound down, its final notes lingering in the air like a sigh. Angela closed the lid with gentle finality. "Captain Hargreaves came to see me yesterday. He wanted to tell me about Margaret, the real Margaret before the schemes and the tragedy. He said she was vibrant and funny, full of dreams. The captain is a good man who was caught up in events beyond his control," Miss Marple observed. "As were you, my dear. I know that now, though I confess there are nights when I wake and think about how he treated me. the man I knew as Dr. Haydock, how he feigned concern, pretended to care about my health and happiness, all while planning to marry me simply to reclaim his stolen fortune. He was a monster, Miss Marple said quietly, but a particularly dangerous kind, the sort who appears civilized and trustworthy. Those are the hardest to detect, because we want to believe in the goodness we see. Your instincts weren't wrong, Angela. A companionable silence settled between them, broken only by birdsong and the distant sound of the church bells striking the hour. Finally, Angela rose. I should go. Dennis is waiting. We're driving to Much Benham to meet with the solicitors about the flood. She reached into her handbag and produced a small envelope. Miss Marple opened the envelope to find a cheque for a substantial sum made out to the St. Mary Mead Church Restoration Fund. It's not nearly enough for what you've done. You saved Dennis from the gallows, cleared innocent people of suspicion, and brought a murderer to justice. Angela's eyes glistened. Aunt Lydia deserved justice. After Angela's departure, Miss Marple sat for a long time in contemplation, the music box beside her on the bench. She thought of Margaret Ashworth, whose desperation had led her into wickedness and ultimately to her death. Of Lydia Ashworth, who had loved a man who never truly existed and paid with her life for discovering the truth of all the small tragic choices that had cascaded across decades, leaving destruction in their wake. The afternoon light slanted through the apple trees, touching everything with an amber glow. From somewhere down the lane came the sound of children laughing, and Mrs. Price Ridley's voice calling after them to mind the gate. Life in St. Mary Mead continued its eternal rhythm, absorbing tragedy and scandal, and moving forward with the resilience of water flowing around stones. Miss Marple picked up the music box and carried it inside. Whatever Angela's intentions, she could not bring herself to see such a beautiful object destroyed. She would keep it, she decided, in her study, not as a macabre trophy, but as a reminder that evil often wore a pleasant face, that greed could corrupt across decades, and that the truth, however long buried, had a way of emerging into the light. She wound the mechanism one final time, letting the haunting melody play through to its conclusion. Then she placed the box on a high shelf, where it would sit silent and still, its warnings delivered, its secrets finally exposed. That evening, as twilight deepened into night, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting and looked out over the peaceful village. Lights glowed in cottage windows. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys. Everything appeared tranquil, innocent, safe. But Miss Marple knew better. She had always known better. Beneath the surface of every seemingly peaceful community lay currents of passion, desperation, and deceit. Human nature, in St. Mary Mead or anywhere else, remained eternally complex, capable of great good and terrible evil, often in the same breast. Her needles clicked steadily in the lamplight, creating order from chaos, pattern from formlessness. It was, she reflected, not unlike detective work itself. One simply had to be patient, observant, and willing to see past surfaces to the truth beneath. The music box sat silent on its shelf, its legend fulfilled and exhausted. It would play no more warnings, herald no more deaths. But Miss Marple would remember its lessons, that the past never truly dies, that secrets have a price, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, has a way of finding its mark. She smiled slightly, her fingers never pausing in their work, and thought that perhaps, after all, St. Mary Mead could return to its usual, pleasantly uneventful routine, at least until the next mystery presented itself.